a genteel tea, a sudden death, a village full of secrets. Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Tell me where you're joining from. Your voices make this mystery worth sharing. Now, let's begin. The afternoon sun fell softly upon the neat hedgerows of St. Aldiths, a village whose most pressing concerns rarely extended beyond the question of whether the grocer's new boy was trustworthy with deliveries. The church clock had just struck 4, and in the sprawling ivy-covered residence known as the Willows, a select gathering was in full swing. Mrs. Euphemia Grant, a woman of imposing manner and unshakable belief in her own good taste, was hosting one of her famed at-homes, an event designed, so she declared, to foster cultural refinement in the parish, though it more often fostered whispered critiques of attire, manners, and marital prospects. The blue parlor, her pride and joy, was the centerpiece of the afternoon. Its walls were painted a striking shade of duck-egg blue, adorned with gilt-framed portraits of long-forgotten ancestors, while polished mahogany tables bore silver trays laden with sandwiches, seed cake, and cups of delicately brewed Darjeeling. Conversation floated in the air, gentle in tone but sharpened in intent, for St. Aldiths excelled at the art of veiled insinuation. By the bay window, Reverend Partridge was explaining, for the third time, the importance of the upcoming church roof repairs, while Mrs. Caroline Dyer was nodding with the air of one who intended to do nothing about it. Near the fireplace, young Julia Blake, in a hat far too large for her head, was quietly engaged in what appeared to be an unreciprocated flirtation with Captain Hugh Penrose, whose attention was firmly fixed on the decanter. Miss Marple, seated in an armchair in a corner, seemed entirely absorbed in knitting a pair of soft gray mittens for the curate's baby. Her pale blue eyes, however, moved from face to face with quiet precision, storing away expressions, gestures, and the subtle changes in tone that spoke volumes. It was during the arrival of the second tea tray that the shift occurred. A peculiar hush spread, as though someone had opened a door to an unexpected draft. Mrs. Grant, halfway through a discussion on the merits of rose versus lavender and potpourri, had frozen in place. Her eyes were fixed on the far end of the blue parlor, where Mr. Lionel Briggs, a retired solicitor of mild temperament and a fondness for lemon biscuits, sat strangely slumped in his chair, his teacup tilted in his hand. Before anyone could quite register what they were seeing, the cup slipped to the carpet, spilling a pale brown stain on Mrs. Grant's treasured Aubusson rug. His head lolled forward. Someone gasped. The Reverend dropped his spoon with a clatter, and Miss Marple, though she rose slowly with the air of one whose joints were not what they used to be, had already noted a curious detail. The teaspoon in Mr. Briggs's saucer bore no trace of tea. The room erupted in a flurry of alarm, voices rising in overlapping questions. But Miss Marple's mind had already moved on from the fallen teacup to the expression, faint, startled, almost offended, frozen upon the late Mr. Briggs's face. Would you like me to continue with the village's reaction next, following the structure you outlined? For a long second, no one moved, as though the blue parlor itself had chosen to hold its breath. Then everything happened at once. Mrs. Grant's hand flew to the bell pull, and she tugged it twice in a manner that suggested the fault lay with the bell. "Edna! Edna, at once!" she cried, her voice pitched higher than its usual commanding contralto. Reverend Partridge stepped forward with an air of clerical usefulness and then faltered, hovering uselessly beside the chair. Caroline Dyer murmured, "Oh, heavens." To no one in particular, sank onto the nearest ottoman, the fabric sighing beneath her silk skirt. Captain Penrose set down the decanter very carefully, as one does who wishes to be remembered for care, not for decanters. And Julia Blake, pale beneath her extravagant hat, pressed a handkerchief to lips that trembled attractively. Miss Marple, who disliked drama except in the theater, reached the arm of Mr. Briggs's chair and touched the inside of his wrist. She did not linger. The absence of a pulse is not improved by double-checking. "I think," she said gently, "that perhaps the doctor should be sent for, and Constable Reed as well." Mrs. Grant seized upon the instruction with gratitude. Orders, unlike the dead, could be managed. "Edna," she repeated as the parlor-maid appeared, breathless and crimson at the edges. "Run for Dr. Atherton and tell Tom Reed to come immediately. Say there's been a sudden collapse." She paused, as if unwilling to let the word death sully her carpet along with the tea. "Go." Edna fled, and in her wake the room tried to become sensible. The Reverend murmured a prayer under his breath, which comforted him, if not Mr. Briggs. Captain Penrose drew the curtains a little against the slant of sunlight that lay across the Aubusson. It seemed indecorous that the afternoon should continue shining. Caroline Dyer, finding that fainting required more talent than she possessed, contented herself with sips of water. Julia remained very still, her eyes fixed on the teacup at the foot of the chair, as though it might betray a motive if she looked at it hard enough. "Poor Lionel," Mrs. Grant said with a shaky composure that would do for now. "He must have had a weak heart. He never said so, but men are so proud about these things." "Mr. Briggs," corrected Miss Marple absently. She preferred proper forms for the dead. Her eyes were moving, unhurried and thorough, not unlike the way one looks for a mislaid needle without seeming to. The teaspoon that had no stain of tea upon it lay in the saucer, prim as a Sunday school child, yet the cup had held tea, enough to leave a splash on the rug when it fell. Miss Marple's glance lifted to the tea table. 2 pots, one with a knitted blue cozy, and the other, squat and silver, for hot water. A dish of slices of lemon, translucent as stained glass, a sugar bowl with cubes and a pair of tongs, a small glass jar of honey. Mrs. Grant considered it genteel to offer honey in the afternoon. The second tray, brought moments before the hush, held a fresh plate of seed cake and the small cut glass bottle of sherry that Mrs. Grant believed medicinal for the older set. "Captain Penrose," Mrs. Grant said suddenly, seizing on the most military person present. "Would you? Do you think it best not to move him?" "Quite," said Captain Penrose, gratefully supplied with something to say. "Best not. Let the doctor. Yes, best not." Miss Marple's pale eyes dwelt for a moment on his hand as it left the curtain. There was nothing on the fingertips that ought not to be there. Even so, the action of drawing the curtain had been an odd choice in a room already well shaded on the north side. People often do small, unnecessary things when nervous. She filed it away with the unstained spoon and the lemon slices, of which one had been taken and then set down again, as though the chooser had changed his mind midway. They did not have long to wait. Dr. Atherton, a spare man with a face like an earnest turnip and hair that had begun to retreat in a gentlemanly fashion, arrived with his bag and a briskness forged by 30 years of being sent for on a run. Behind him came Constable Tom Reed, whose boots always announced him a step before his person did. There followed the small formalities, Dr. Atherton's brief examination, his low murmur to Mrs. Grant, the constable's careful questions that implied nothing and gathered much. "Heart," Dr. Atherton said at first, softly enough to allow a lady to accept it. "A sudden seizure is not uncommon in a gentleman of his years." He glanced at Miss Marple, who was looking mildly at the lemon dish. "Although," he added, which was not what Mrs. Grant wanted to hear. There is a faint, perhaps I am fanciful, but a faint odor. Almonds. Are there marzipans about, Mrs. Grant? No, said Mrs. Grant, startled. Certainly not. I never liked them. They cling dreadfully. Miss Marple did not look up. Sometimes, she said as if to herself, people who dislike sweetness sweeten their tea anyway, for the sake of form. I have noticed men do it when they are being poured for by ladies they wish to please. Captain Penrose laughed abruptly, too loudly. That would be a novelty in St. Aldiths, men pleasing ladies. Constable Reed cleared his throat, a sound that in him meant, let us keep to the path. If you please, ma'am, he said to Mrs. Grant with patient respect. Who poured Mr. Briggs's tea? Mrs. Grant blinked. Why, I did. I always pour in the blue parlor. It is a tradition. I asked Mr. Briggs whether he wished for lemon or milk, and he said lemon. No sugar. He was very particular. Lemon, no sugar, repeated the constable, writing it down as if the words could later be rearranged to absolve someone. And who handed him the cup? Julia did, said Caroline Dyer unexpectedly, her voice crisp now that usefulness was at hand. She was nearest the bay window. He had just finished telling Captain Penrose about a dreadful case of someone's will gone astray. Us. She paused, realizing perhaps what she had said. That is, something from his practice, she amended, before he retired. Julia's hand tightened around the handkerchief. He asked me, and I gave it him. There was nothing. She stopped. Her eyes flickered, not to the cup but to the small glass jar of honey. Miss Marple saw that flicker and thought of a dozen village teas where honey had been chosen, not because one liked honey, but because sugar cubes stuck to fingers and made a little clink in the cup that one did not wish remarked upon. It's so much easier to lull wasps with honey. Old Mr. Potter had once said to her at the harvest fete when they were guarding the jam stall. She wondered whether Mr. Briggs had altered his habits to suit a hostess, whether he had spoken lemon, no sugar from politeness or pride, and whether someone had relied upon the phrase. Doctor, she said very mild, do you think it would be wise to take the pot and the accoutrements to your surgery? It would prevent any mischance with the servants. Dr. Atherton looked at her with a quick understanding that had grown from many small encounters. Her unobtrusive observations at sickbeds, her habit of asking the question that made a better diagnosis. Yes, he said. Constable, I should be obliged if you'd see to it. All of it, the pot, the lemon, the sugar, the lot. Mrs. Grant looked offended by the word lot, but only slightly. It occurred to her that suspicion, like dust, settled most quickly on surfaces not often polished. She straightened her shoulders. Of course, we must be thorough. I will have Edna fetch a box. The removal of the tea things took on the solemnity of a reliquary. Constable Reed, big hands careful, West, lifted the teapot cozy with 2 fingers as though it might explode into scandal. Julia stood aside to let him pass and, in doing so, brushed the back of a chair. There was a faint dark smear at the edge of the arm, no more than the memory of a fingerprint. Miss Marple noticed that too, without looking at it again. Now then, said the constable, if you please, I will ask, where was everyone placed? Mrs. Grant, perhaps you could show me. We'll go once round and then let you all go to your homes. There is nothing like being asked where one sat to make English people remember their exact positions with religious fervor. The circle assembled obligingly. Mrs. Grant indicated her own place at the head of the tea table. To her right, Reverend Partridge. Opposite him, Caroline Dyer. Near the fireplace, Captain Penrose. By the bay window, Julia. And in the corner, unobtrusive as a cushion, Miss Marple. Mr. Briggs's chair was a little apart, angled toward the garden view as though he had intended to admire it more than the company. "He moved it," Julia said quietly. "When he came in, he said the light was better there." "The light," repeated Miss Marple. "Yes. One sees better the color of things in proper light." "Do you mean poison?" Caroline asked suddenly. Her eyes were bright, the way eyes grow bright when danger is contained in a word and not yet attached to an acquaintance. "Surely not. Here? Words like that," the Reverend began, gently reproving. Dr. Atherton, who had been repacking his bag, closed it with a decisive click. "I will say nothing certain until I have examined him at the surgery," he announced, "which I shall do with proper assistance. Tom, if you will help me." He glanced at Mrs. Grant. "We'll be as quiet as we can." It was done quietly. Men came. There is a tact to moving the newly dead, which, when done well, makes a room breathe again. The blue parlor, shorn of its unexpected centerpiece, looked at once larger and more trivial. Mrs. Grant requested that everyone might adjourn for a few moments to the morning room while she had the parlor set right. This, everyone understood, was a mercy to the furniture. In the morning room the air was thinner, as if gossip had consumed a portion of the oxygen in anticipation. They sat or stood and adopted attitudes of recollection. The obvious explanations presented themselves like overeager callers. He had been unwell for weeks, someone would say, only to be corrected by another who had seen Mr. Briggs mowing his own lawn yesterday. Which lawn, it was agreed, he kept in an ungentlemanly condition of neatness. He had spoken with Mrs. Pott about the price of eggs. He had told the Reverend that his sermon had been excessive by 1/4 of an inch, a phrase which amused Mrs. Dyer and irritated the Reverend enough to be repeated. Miss Marple listened and knitted. She had slipped the mittens back into her bag, but kept the needles out as conversation props. Knit 2, purl 2. People relax under the click of needles. They expose the underside of their talk. She watched Julia's hands, small and unsteady, and the way Captain Penrose's gaze avoided both the girl and the tea story. She noticed Caroline watching everyone and being careful to be seen to watch no one in particular. She heard, in the river of talk, a pebble strike the surface. "I suppose," said Caroline with airy thoughtfulness, "that Mr. Briggs must have been very dull in his retirement. Solicitors are forever losing interest in life when there are no more wills to meddle with." "On the contrary," said the Reverend, stung into dignity. "Mr. Briggs told me on Tuesday he was advising a friend as a favor. He said he was very much interested." There was a little silence. Miss Marple did not look up. One does not look at a fish at the moment it takes the hook. "How kind of him," she said softly. "People are so good in their friendships in St. Aldith's." "Do you know whose will, Vicar?" Captain Penrose asked, casual as a cigarette lit in an empty room. "I did not inquire," the Reverend said, stiffening. "It is not my habit to rummage in people's private affairs." "It never is until you know whose," Caroline murmured. The door opened, and Constable Reed put in his head. "If you please," he said. "Dr. Atherton will be sending word presently. In the meantime, I should like statements. Nothing formal. Where you were, what you saw. I'll come to each of you in turn." There was a general stir. Miss Marple rose a little before she was called and drifted, like a leaf caught in a small current, toward the hallway. She did not intend to leave. Mrs. Grant would have taken it amiss. But there were things one can see in the quiet margins that one cannot in the middle of a crowd. The blue parlor had been restored to a semblance of composure. The aubusson showed only the ghost of a stain. Edna, flushed with the importance of disaster, was plumping cushions with the solemnity of a ritual. She bobbed when she saw Miss Marple. "Oh, miss, what a terrible thing." "Very sad, Edna," Miss Marple agreed. "You were very quick with your legs. Did you notice anything as you ran?" "People often do, when they think they do not." Edna frowned with the effort of turning back her memory. Only that Mr. Briggs's hat was on the console, and then when I came back from the gate it wasn't. Mrs. Grant had moved it to the stand proper. She doesn't like hats on the console. She says it marks the wood. Quite right, hats do. And Mr. Briggs's stick? He hadn't one, miss. He never does. He always says a stick is an admission. Does he indeed? Miss Marple smiled and let the girl return to her cushions. She stood a moment in the doorway and looked again at the tea table, now naked of its dangerous charm. On the linen cloth, a faint ring had been left by a saucer that was no longer there, farther to the left than it ought to have been if Mrs. Grant's arrangement had been observed. People change the world to suit themselves in small ways. A moved chair for the light. A saucer shifted for a left-handed reach. A lemon slice lifted and set down again. It is in those rearrangements that character speaks. Constable Reed found her thus and cleared his throat in his polite fashion. "If you please, Miss Marple, just a few questions." "Of course, Tom," she said, and sat near the window where she could see the sweep of the front garden and the gate through which Dr. Atherton's car had gone. The roses were in second bloom. Mrs. Grant prided herself that they did not understand the notion of fatigue. The questions were simple, and Miss Marple's answers were simple too. She had seen Mrs. Grant pour. She had heard Mr. Briggs say, "Lemon, no sugar." She had noticed Captain Penrose at the decanter and Julia by the window. She had noticed very little else. Being old, one's eyes are not what they were. Except that Mr. Briggs, who had never liked seed cake on account of the seeds, had taken a slice and eaten half. "Which suggests," Miss Marple said gently, "that he was distracted or being amiable." When she had finished, the constable hesitated, as if there were a larger question tugging at the sleeve of his smaller ones. "Miss Marple," he said at last, "you will tell me, won't you, if anything strikes you as it shouldn't?" Miss Marple smiled at him with a kindness that did not promise more than it could deliver. "Of course, Tom. If I see anything amiss, I shall say so. One always should." He went away reassured, as men are when older ladies offer to be sensible. Miss Marple stayed where she was a moment longer, thinking of men who admit nothing, not sticks, not sugar. Of girls whose hands shake when honey is on the table. Of captains who draw curtains to avoid looking at what cannot be avoided. She thought of wills, and the way talk of them sets people's eyes alight in just such a manner as a shop window at Christmastide. She thought of the faint, imagined smell of almonds, the unstained spoon. When she rose, it was with the appearance of having remembered something domestic. A stitch, perhaps. She went to the console in the hall where Mr. Briggs's hat had stood briefly. There, just beneath where the brim would have rested, was a minute sprinkle of white. No more than 3 or 4 pinpoints, caught in the groove of the wood. Sugar crystals, Miss Marple thought. But the cubes had been in the bowl with their edges intact. Sugar that had been pinched then, perhaps with fingers and not the tongs. Or sugar that was not sugar. She touched none of it. She had once known a little girl who put salt on a sugar biscuit as a joke, and had been very sorry afterward. Villages are full of small substitutions that lead to large consequences. From the back of the house came the low murmur of voices. Mrs. Grant dismissing Edna. Caroline's laugh, bright as glass. The Reverend's careful comfort. The evening had begun to draw its long blue line across the lawns, and the blue parlor, for all its name, had deepened to a different shade. Miss Marple folded her hands upon her bag and went to rejoin the others, her eyes mild and content, like a cat that has learned where the mouse runs, but is in no hurry to lay a paw upon it yet. The hush that had settled over the willows lingered into the evening, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the shock and were reluctant to release it. Outside, the August twilight crept over St. Aldith's with its usual unhurried grace, painting the neat cottages and climbing roses in muted shades of blue and silver. Yet within Mrs. Grant's morning room, the air was thick with something far less gentle. The guests, reduced in number now, were making polite arrangements to leave, though each was loath to do so too quickly. For leaving too early might suggest indifference, while staying too long might invite suspicion. In a village such as St. Aldith's, the choreography of one's departure was as telling as one's words. Miss Marple had resumed her knitting, though she had done scarcely 2 inches since Mr. Briggs had collapsed. She did not mind. The click of the needles was her disguise. They gave her an air of harmless domesticity that encouraged confidences, as she well knew. Beside her, Julia Blake sat with hands folded tightly in her lap, her large hat now resting on the chair beside her. Without the brim to shadow her features, she looked younger and more vulnerable, though there was a certain tension about her mouth, as if she were holding back something best left unsaid. "You must allow me to send you home, my dear," Mrs. Grant was saying, her tone a mixture of hospitality and command. "It's too far for you to walk at this hour. I shall have Davis fetch the trap." "Oh no, please, I'd rather walk," Julia protested quickly, glancing toward the window as though the open air might be a relief after so much closeness. Her protest was met with a raised brow from Mrs. Grant and an indulgent little smile. "Nonsense. After what's happened, one doesn't walk about in the dark alone. Appearances, my dear." Captain Penrose, who had been leaning against the mantelpiece in what he believed to be a casually protective stance, straightened. "I'll see her home, Mrs. Grant, if you'd like. Just a short stroll, and I could do with the air myself." He said it lightly, but Miss Marple noticed the way his gaze flickered to Julia's hands and away again. Julia gave him a quick, uncertain smile, the kind that acknowledges kindness without quite accepting it. Mrs. Grant appeared to consider, then inclined her head. "Very well. But don't dawdle. The constable may want to speak to you again tomorrow, Julia. And Hugh, do try not to make the villagers talk more than they already will." "They'd manage without me," Penrose replied, but there was no humor in it. Caroline Dyer, who had been watching this little exchange with open interest, interjected with her own farewell, though she lingered by the doorway, as if she expected something worth overhearing to fall from the air before she stepped out. The Reverend had already gone, summoned to the vicarage by a note delivered via one of the village boys. He had left in a state of solemn bustle, his cassock skirts nearly catching on the gate. By the time the others had gone, and only Miss Marple and Mrs. Grant remained, the blue parlor was once again a quiet, decorous room, though the knowledge of what had occurred there still clung to the air, like the scent of a burnt candle. Mrs. Grant fussed with the arrangement of the chairs, moving Mr. Briggs's back to its original position, and then smoothing the Aubusson rug where the tea had spilt. "I can't bear disorder," she remarked, though her voice lacked its usual firmness. "It makes one feel as if things have slipped beyond control." Miss Marple gave a small hum of agreement. It is always best to put a room to rights. Though sometimes, one sees more clearly if things are left as they fell. Mrs. Grant paused, a cushion in her hands, and looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and faint disapproval. "You mean for the police?" "For anyone who is trying to understand what happened," Miss Marple replied mildly. "In my experience, people show themselves not only in what they do, but in what they disturb." This earned her a sharp glance, but no answer. Mrs. Grant was not a woman to encourage conversation that wandered too close to the uncomfortable. Miss Marple took her leave soon after, stepping into the cool air of the evening. The path from the willows to her cottage wound past the churchyard and along a hedge that had been neatly trimmed only the week before. She walked slowly, her knitting tucked neatly into her bag, her thoughts sifting through the impressions of the afternoon. She had not missed Julia's unease, nor the captain's careful avoidance of her gaze. Nor had she missed Caroline's deliberate mention of Will's and Mr. Briggs's alleged boredom. And then there was that faint trace of almonds, perhaps imagined, perhaps not, and the unstained spoon. The next morning, St. Aldith's awoke to the news in full bloom. Gossip, like honeysuckle, spread swiftly, twining itself around every conversation. At the post office, Mrs. Harbottle confided to the grocer's wife that Mr. Briggs had been perfectly well the day before, which was surely suspicious. At the Green, Mr. Pott assured anyone who would listen that the man had been going downhill for weeks, which was equally suspicious in a different way. By mid-morning, everyone agreed that a sudden death at Mrs. Grant's was both a tragedy and, if they were honest, a considerable event. Miss Marple received her first caller before she had even cleared away her breakfast things. It was Caroline Dyer, brisk and bright-eyed, carrying a small parcel of scones for company. She accepted tea and sat near the window, remarking that one ought to be cautious about tea after such occurrences, and then set about weaving her own version of the events. "You saw how Julia was, Jane," she said, leaning forward, shaking like a leaf, and not just from shock, I'd wager. "And Captain Penrose, so very attentive. It makes one wonder. People often cling together after a shock," Miss Marple observed, pouring tea with steady hands. "It doesn't always mean there's anything more to it." "Perhaps," Caroline allowed, though she smiled as one does when politely disagreeing. But Mr. Briggs wasn't the sort to inspire strong feeling in anyone, except, perhaps, if he were interfering in some matter best left alone. Miss Marple let her talk, only occasionally prompting with a mild question. Caroline hinted, without quite saying, that Julia might have had reason to dislike Mr. Briggs, something to do with a matter he had been advising upon. She was less forthcoming about the captain, though her tone suggested she thought it significant that he had been near the decanter when the tea was poured. When Caroline left, Miss Marple reflected that such visits were as much about the speaker's performance as the information conveyed. One learned as much from what was emphasized as from what was omitted. Shortly after noon, Constable Reed called. He was polite but businesslike, his notebook in hand. "Doctor, Atherton sent word," he told her. "He's not prepared to make a formal statement yet, but there's enough to say it wasn't natural causes. He wants further tests." Miss Marple nodded. "You'll be speaking to Mrs. Grant again, I suppose?" "Aye, and the others. I'll have to ask about anything Mr. Briggs was involved in. Business matters, disagreements. It's not much to go on, though." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said, "people tell you more when they don't realize they're being questioned. You'll find that Mrs. Grant's morning room might be as useful as your station, Tom. People talk more easily in familiar chairs." Reed smiled faintly. "You've a way of putting things, Miss Marple. I'll keep that in mind." That afternoon, Miss Marple made a point of walking through the village. She stopped at the greengrocer's for apples, lingered at the baker's for a fresh loaf, and chatted with Mrs. Harbottle at the post office about the weather. In each place, she allowed the conversation to turn, as it inevitably would, to Mr. Briggs. And in each place, she listened, not just to the words, but to the little hesitations, the glances exchanged, the names that were not mentioned until one prompted them. By the time she returned home, she had learned several useful things. Mr. Briggs had recently been seen in the company of a man from much tethering, a Mr. Calthorpe, who was said to be engaged in a dispute over an inheritance. Julia Blake had been overheard arguing with Mr. Briggs outside the churchyard a fortnight ago, though the subject was not known. And Captain Penrose had been inquiring, discreetly but not discreetly enough, about certain investments Mr. Briggs might have managed for a mutual acquaintance. In the evening, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the swifts dip and turn against the fading sky. The pattern was there, if one knew how to look for it. People rarely commit crimes without first disturbing the surface of their lives, even if only in the smallest ways. A moved chair, an untouched spoon, a slice of lemon lifted and replaced. All such disturbances left ripples. And somewhere among those ripples lay the truth of Mr. Briggs's death. It was, as Miss Marple well knew, simply a matter of allowing them to settle in the right order. By the following morning, the weather had turned. A fine mist hung over St. Aldith's, softening the outlines of the church spire and the row of cottages along the high street. The cobbles gleamed damply, and the air carried the faint smell of earth and roses after rain. It was the sort of morning that encouraged people to linger indoors, which in St. Aldith's meant the drawing rooms and parlors were humming with quiet conversation. The death of Mr. Briggs had not yet grown stale. Indeed, in a village where small events expanded to fill the available space, it had taken on the character of a living presence, never far from anyone's mind, and apt to appear uninvited in the middle of other topics. Miss Marple had scarcely finished her breakfast when there came a knock at her garden gate. Opening the door, she found Constable Reed standing with a slightly apologetic expression. His boots were already damp from the morning's rounds. "I wonder," he began, "if you'd walk with me up to the Willows. Mrs. Grant's agreed to a follow-up, and I think you might, well, see things I wouldn't." Miss Marple regarded him mildly. "You think I might persuade people to talk?" "Something like that," Reed admitted. "They're more apt to chat with you than with me, and if I come with you, they won't think you're snooping." She smiled faintly. "Oh, Tom, in villages people always think one is snooping. It's only a question of whether they mind." They walked together along the lane, Miss Marple keeping a steady pace with the aid of her polished stick. The mist seemed to muffle sound, so that the clip of their steps was oddly prominent. As they approached the Willows, the front garden came into view, its roses still heavy with droplets. Mrs. Grant's housemaid, Edna, was on her knees near the porch, scrubbing a brass boot scraper until it gleamed. Inside, Mrs. Grant greeted them with a measured cordiality. "I suppose it's necessary," she said, leading them to the blue parlor. "Though I do hope we're not to be in the newspapers. It gives a place such a common air." The room was exactly as it had been arranged after the incident. Chairs aligned, rug straightened, tea table set to its proper symmetry. But Miss Marple, whose memory for spatial arrangement was almost photographic, noticed one small change. The bay window curtains, which Captain Penrose had drawn in the afternoon light, were now tied neatly back. On the sill stood a small pot of white geraniums that had not been there before. "Such a shame about Mr. Briggs," Mrs. Grant went on, with the tone of one fulfilling a social obligation. "He was an amiable enough man, but I can't pretend we were intimates. Still, one doesn't expect one's guests to expire mid-tea." Reed began his questions, careful and methodical, while Miss Marple sat with her knitting in her lap, her attention apparently wandering to the geraniums. She let Mrs. Grant speak at length about the afternoon, prompting her only once. "When you poured the tea," Miss Marple said gently, "was the order of service quite as usual? Cups passed the same way, spoons in their places?" Mrs. Grant frowned slightly. "Naturally. I pride myself on a proper table. Mr. Briggs was the third to be served. Julia Blake passed his cup, as you know." "And the lemon slices?" "I asked whether he wanted lemon or milk. He said lemon. I gave it to him myself, with the tongs." Miss Marple nodded, though she knew from the day itself that the lemon slice had been lifted and set down again before the cup was passed. She said nothing. It was useful to know how the hostess remembered it. When Reed had finished, Mrs. Grant excused herself to speak to her cook about luncheon, leaving Miss Marple and the constable alone in the blue parlor. "You've noticed something," Reed said quietly. "I've noticed," Miss Marple replied, "that memory is often edited by the desire to seem correct. That is useful to remember." From the Willows, they walked to Julia Blake's lodgings, a modest upstairs room in a house kept by Mrs. Emmett, a widow with a fondness for chrysanthemums. Julia answered the door herself, wearing a pale cardigan and looking as though sleep had been a stranger. Reed asked the usual questions, and Julia's answers were polite, if a little guarded. It was only when he inquired whether she had spoken to Mr. Briggs before the tea that she hesitated. "I might have," she said at last. "We spoke occasionally. He knew some people I knew." Miss Marple, who had been gazing idly at a vase of chrysanthemums on the mantel, spoke without looking up. "Was one of those people Mr. Calthorpe from Much Tethering?" Julia started slightly. "Yes. How did you—" "Oh, my dear, one hears things. St. Aldith's is very fond of Much Tethering just now. It's almost like a twin village, with the way gossip travels back and forth." Julia gave a small, reluctant nod. "Mr. Calthorpe is my uncle. There's been trouble in the family over my grandfather's will. Mr. Briggs was advising him, but it's nothing to do with me." Miss Marple did not contradict her. She only asked, "And yet you were upset at the tea?" Julia's fingers twisted the edge of her cardigan. "It was such a shock. I suppose I did look odd, but I had no reason to harm him." When they left, Reed muttered, "She's holding something back." "Very likely," Miss Marple agreed. "But people sometimes do that for reasons quite unconnected with a death." Their next visit was to Captain Penrose, who occupied a small cottage on the edge of the village, its garden more weeds than flowers. He met them in the doorway, his manner brisk but faintly defensive. "You'll want to ask about the decanter?" he said without waiting for Reed to begin. "Yes, I was near it. No, I didn't touch Mr. Briggs's tea. I was pouring myself a splash of sherry, and if that's a crime, then you'll have to arrest half the county." Miss Marple regarded him with mild interest. "You were also kind enough to draw the curtains. Very thoughtful." His gaze flickered, just as it had in the blue parlor. "The light was in my eyes." "Of course. And you didn't happen to hear what Mr. Briggs and Julia Blake were discussing before the tea?" "No," he said quickly. "Why would I?" "Curiosity," Miss Marple murmured. "It's a great village virtue." When they took their leave, Reed sighed. "If anything, I've more questions now. Good, Miss Marple said. Questions are more valuable than answers at this stage. That evening, back in her own cottage, Miss Marple sat by her lamp and reviewed the day's conversations. Mrs. Grant with her precise recollections that didn't quite match the truth. Julia, nervous and withholding. Captain Penrose, quick to deny and quicker to deflect. And threaded through it all the matter of wills and inheritances, of Mr. Calthorpe and his dispute. The pieces were not yet in place, but the edges of the puzzle were beginning to show. Outside, the mist had lifted, and the moon cast a pale path across the garden. Somewhere in the village, the clock struck 9. Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly and set it aside. Tomorrow, she decided, she would find a reason to call on Mrs. Harbottle at the post office. Letters, after all, had a way of revealing things that their writers never intended. The following morning brought with it a crisp clarity after the previous day's mist. The roofs of St. Aldith's glistened faintly in the pale sunlight, and the air was edged with the faint scent of wood smoke from early fires. Miss Marple, who believed that one should never underestimate the conversational value of an errand, took her shopping basket and made her way toward the post office. Mrs. Harbottle was behind the counter, spectacles perched halfway down her nose, her fingers busy with the franking machine. She looked up with a smile that suggested genuine pleasure at the arrival of news, in whatever form it came. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I was just saying to Mr. Harbottle how quiet it's been, except, of course, for all the talk." "Talk does have a way of finding a gap to fill," Miss Marple said mildly. "I thought I'd pick up some notepaper, and perhaps you might put a packet on the next post to my nephew in London." The transaction was conducted at a suitably leisurely pace, during which Mrs. Harbottle volunteered, without prompting, that she had seen Mr. Briggs in the post office 3 days before his death. Came in to send a letter registered. He was particular about it. Said it had to reach much tethering without delay. She lowered her voice. "To a Mr. Calthorpe. Do you suppose that's the one they've all been whispering about?" Miss Marple's eyes were gently curious. "I dare say it might be. Did you happen to see him address it?" "Oh, yes. I have to check these things, you know." His hand was shaking a bit, now that I think of it. And he stood there for a moment after I gave him the receipt, as if he were making up his mind about something. Then he nodded to himself and walked out. Miss Marple thanked her and made her way back along the high street, her mind sorting through this fresh scrap of information. A registered letter to Mr. Calthorpe, sent only days before the tea, and Mr. Briggs dead before he could follow it up. It was another thread in the pattern, though she could not yet see how it would tie in. At her gate, she met Caroline Dyer, who appeared to be on her way somewhere, but lingered when she saw Miss Marple. "I was just coming to find you," Caroline said brightly. "Have you heard the latest? Dr. Atherton's tests have confirmed it. Poison. Cyanide, if you can imagine such a thing." No wonder the poor man looked startled. Miss Marple inclined her head gravely. "That does explain the faint smell of almonds. It also explains why the police are looking at who handled the tea. Everyone's saying Julia Blake was the last to touch his cup. Of course, the girl's a fool, but I don't think she's wicked. At least not wicked enough for murder. People can be wicked in small ways and not in great," Miss Marple observed. "And sometimes it is the small wickedness that leads to the greater." Caroline gave her a look half curious, half cautious. "Do you think you know something, Jane?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that people often overlook the obvious because it doesn't fit the picture they prefer. But I shall reserve judgment." That afternoon, Constable Reed stopped by Miss Marple's cottage with an update. "The cyanide could have been introduced into the tea or the lemon," he said. The sugar cubes were clean. Mrs. Grant swears she sliced the lemon herself just before the tea. But of course, she didn't watch the tray every second. Few hostesses do, Miss Marple said, especially when greeting guests. Reed nodded. I've been trying to find out who had opportunity. Julia carried the cup, but Captain Penrose was close enough to the table, and Caroline was too. And Edna swears she never touched a thing once she brought in the second tray. Miss Marple asked, "And the letter to Mr. Calthorpe? Have you traced it?" Reed's brows rose. "How did you know about that?" "One hears things," she said with a small smile. "It was delivered the day after Mr. Briggs died," Reed told her. "Mr. Calthorpe has refused to show it to us. Says it's a private legal matter. We can't compel him without more grounds." Miss Marple reflected that private legal matters often contain the most public consequences. The next morning, she decided on a little walk toward the edge of the village, where Captain Penrose's cottage stood. The gate was half open, and the captain himself was in the garden, attempting, with little success, to prune a rose bush. "Good morning, Captain," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I was just admiring your roses. They do struggle after the rain, don't they?" Penrose straightened, wiping his hands on a cloth. "They've never done well. But the thorns keep people from poking about." "A useful quality," Miss Marple agreed. "Rather like certain human dispositions." He gave her a sharp look. "Meaning?" "Only that some people prefer to be left alone, and sometimes they go to great lengths to ensure it. For example, if someone wished to keep a conversation private, they might arrange to be near a decanter rather than a tea table." Penrose's jaw tightened. "I told the constable I didn't touch Briggs's cup. Why would I? Perhaps to prevent him from saying something, or perhaps to prevent him from not saying it," Miss Marple said gently. "It is curious, though, that you and Mr. Briggs both had dealings with mutual acquaintances in much tethering." He hesitated, then shrugged. "If you mean Calthorpe, yes, I've known him for years. But I've no interest in his family squabbles. I don't even like the man." Miss Marple thanked him and took her leave, but she noted the faint unease in his tone. That evening, as she sat knitting, she thought over the chain of events again. The pouring of the tea, the movement of the cup, the lemon slice lifted and set down, the unstained spoon, the hat moved from the console. Every small act had been the result of someone's decision, and decisions were made for reasons. She was still turning this over in her mind when a knock came at her door. It was Julia Blake, pale and visibly troubled. "I shouldn't be here," Julia began, "but I don't know who else to talk to. They all think I did it, poisoned him. I swear to you I didn't." "Then tell me what you are afraid to tell the police," Miss Marple said kindly. Julia twisted her hands together. "It's about the will. My uncle, Mr. Calthorpe, wanted Mr. Briggs to draw up something that would cut out another relative. I didn't approve. I told Mr. Briggs so. He said he couldn't discuss it with me because of client confidentiality, but he hinted that he might not go through with it. That's why I was upset at the tea. I thought he was going to make a scene." "Why a scene?" "Because I saw him put a folded paper into his pocket just before. I thought it might be the draft will. But if it was, it wasn't on him when they took him away. The constable told me so." Miss Marple's knitting needles were motionless in her hands. "That," she said, "is very interesting indeed." Julia looked at her anxiously. "Do you think that means—" "It means," Miss Marple said, "that we must ask ourselves who had both the opportunity to poison Mr. Briggs and to remove that paper from his person without being noticed. And my dear, the number of people who could have done both is not as large as you might think. Julia left soon after, looking somewhat relieved to have spoken. Miss Marple sat for some time longer, the ticking of the clock loud in the quiet room. The missing paper, she knew, would prove to be the hinge upon which the whole affair turned. And if she was right, someone in St. Aldith's had already realized that it was missing, and was making certain it would never be found. The next day dawned clear and bright, though the air in St. Aldith's seemed somehow sharper, as though the entire village was braced for something. By breakfast, Miss Marple had already made her decision. If the missing paper truly was the key to Mr. Briggs's death, then the person who now possessed it would sooner or later betray themselves. Not by what they said, but by what they did to keep it hidden. She began her morning as any unremarkable villager might, attending to her geraniums, exchanging a few polite words with passing neighbors, and strolling down to the greengrocer for a small basket of apples. All the while, she turned over the likely suspects in her mind. Mrs. Grant had proximity, Julia had handled the cup, and Captain Penrose had positioned himself oddly during the tea. Caroline Dyer had been seated to observe almost everyone, which in some ways was the most dangerous place of all. On her way home, she met Constable Reed, who looked slightly harried. "I've been chasing up the lemon," he said without preamble. The fruit was delivered to Mrs. Grant 2 days before the tea, same as always, from the High Street shop. No one seems to have tampered with it there. But the slices, well, anyone could have touched them once they were on the plate. "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "Lemon is a convenient carrier for many things. One has only to handle it carelessly, and it will carry a trace." Reed frowned. "You sound as though you've seen it before." "I have," she said simply, though in quite a different context. An unfortunate luncheon where the cook thought herself clever in disguising the taste of overripe fish. The results were less final than in our present case, but still unpleasant. Reed gave her a wry look. "I wish this one were only unpleasant. Oh, one other thing. Dr. Atherton's been through Briggs's effects. No sign of any folded paper or legal document on him when he died." Miss Marple's expression was mild. "So the paper was removed between his death and the time he was carried from the room." Reed hesitated. "That's what it looks like. And that means, Miss Marple finished for him, that the pool of suspects is smaller still." By mid-morning, Miss Marple had a quiet word with Mrs. Harbottle at the post office, ostensibly to inquire after a book she was expecting. Mrs. Harbottle, who was both a reliable source of information and a great believer in the sanctity of her position, was happy to pass along one nugget. "There's been a bit of fuss at the much tethering end. Mr. Calthorpe's man was seen riding into town in a hurry, looking as if he'd had bad news. Folks there say he'd been expecting important papers that didn't turn up. I couldn't say more, of course." Miss Marple could. It fitted neatly with Julia's account. If the paper Briggs had carried was indeed the draft will, its absence from both his person and Calthorpe's hands meant that someone in the Willows that day had intercepted it. In the afternoon, Miss Marple decided to pay Mrs. Grant another call. She took with her a small jar of homemade jam, knowing full well that politeness would ensure an invitation indoors. Sure enough, she was soon seated in the morning room, tea placed before her, and Mrs. Grant engaged in a slightly defensive chatter about how dreadful it was to have the constable asking questions as though one were a suspect. "My dear Mrs. Grant," Miss Marple said soothingly, "it is only thoroughness. One never knows how a little thing, say, The placing of a hat or the movement of a chair can make a great difference in the understanding of an event. Mrs. Grant pursed her lips. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Everything was quite as it should be. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Of course. I only wondered. When you moved Mr. Briggs's hat from the console to the stand, did you happen to notice whether there was anything else there? Papers, perhaps. The other woman gave a sharp glance. Certainly not. And if there had been, I should have left them alone. That was not quite the same as saying there had not been any, Miss Marple reflected. She let the subject drop, turning the talk to the challenges of keeping silver polished in the damp air. From the Willows, she walked straight to Caroline Dyer's house, finding the lady in her front garden trimming dead blooms from her roses. Caroline welcomed her warmly enough, though she was quick to mention that she had told the constable everything. That is wise, Miss Marple said. And what a view you must have had, sitting as you did, able to see both the tea table and the bay window. Caroline smiled thinly. One does notice things. For example, Julia's hand shook when she passed Briggs the cup, and Captain Penrose was definitely watching her, though whether out of concern or calculation, I couldn't say. And you, my dear, what did you do when the second tray came in? Oh, I leaned over to take a slice of seed cake before Mrs. Grant could finish rearranging everything. She likes to fuss with a tray as though it were a stage scene. Miss Marple's eyes softened. So you were closest to the lemon plate just before Mr. Briggs's cup was served. The smile faltered, only for an instant. I suppose so, but surely you're not suggesting. Not at all, Miss Marple said. It is only that position is sometimes as telling as action. That evening, Constable Reed came by with a small update. Atherton's found that the cyanide was pure enough to have come from a chemist's, not a household source. I'm checking the local registers now. Miss Marple considered. It might be more useful to look for someone who would not need to purchase it openly. A retired military man might have some, for example, or a gardener who once kept it for pests. People are very resourceful in hanging on to dangerous things. Reed nodded slowly. You're thinking of Penrose. I am thinking, Miss Marple said, that opportunity, means, and motive rarely wear the same coat. But when they do, one must look closely. That night, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting in her lap, but her mind entirely elsewhere. The puzzle was becoming clearer. The paper Briggs had carried was likely the draft will. Its disappearance coincided neatly with his death, and whoever took it had also ensured he would never speak of it. The lemon slice, the positioning around the tea table, the subtle movements in the moments before, these were the brushstrokes in a portrait she was nearly ready to see in full. Only one thing troubled her: the speed. Whoever acted had done so quickly, in the open, without betraying themselves to half a dozen pairs of watchful eyes. That suggested either remarkable nerve or careful preparation, or both. And as she wound her ball of yarn for the evening, Miss Marple decided that tomorrow she would test a small theory. Not directly, of course. One never startled a mouse from its hole by banging on the skirting board. But with the right question, asked in the right way, she might see the flicker that told her which hole to watch. The next morning was one of those bright, deceptive days when the sunlight fell cheerfully on the village. Yet the air carried a faint chill that hinted at the coming change of season. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table with the local paper unopened beside her teacup, her mind busy with the small trap she intended to set. It was not to be anything so vulgar as an accusation, nor even a pointed question. Rather, it would be a small, almost trivial remark, offered in such a way that the guilty party might betray themselves through the smallest of involuntary reactions. She chose her moment carefully. There was to be a gathering at the vicarage that afternoon, a meeting of the parish committee to discuss arrangements for the harvest fete. It was a commonplace event, and therefore an excellent stage upon which to observe certain people under the illusion that their movements and expressions were of no consequence. The attendees would include Mrs. Grant, Caroline Dyer, Captain Penrose, and, at the vicar's urging, Julia Blake. Constable Reed had agreed to drop in on some pretext, having been told by Miss Marple that it would be useful for him to be present. The meeting began in the vicarage's sunlit drawing room, with Reverend Partridge discoursing at length on the merits of raffling a ham versus a fruit basket. Mrs. Grant favored the ham, declaring that it lent a certain substance to the proceedings. Caroline Dyer demurred, claiming that a fruit basket was more in keeping with refinement, though her real concern appeared to be that Mrs. Grant should not have her way unchallenged. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the window, contributed little to the discussion. Her eyes moved gently from face to face, noting how Julia's gaze wandered to the door at intervals, as if she hoped to make an early escape, and how Captain Penrose tapped a finger against his knee whenever Mrs. Grant spoke. When the conversation turned to the arrangement of stalls, Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice mild. "Speaking of arrangements," she said, "it reminds me of the curious way things must be moved about at a tea table when one is serving many people. Why, I was thinking just the other day how very awkward it must be if someone is left-handed. Everything has to be shifted about for them, and the cups and saucers end up in quite a different place from where they began." It was a harmless enough observation, and the others received it with polite smiles, except for two people. Caroline Dyer's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly toward Mrs. Grant before she busied herself with straightening her gloves. Captain Penrose's tapping ceased entirely, and he looked briefly, sharply, toward Miss Marple, before resuming his casual air. The reactions were fleeting, but they were enough. Constable Reed, who had been leaning on the back of a chair with an air of mild interest, caught Miss Marple's glance. She gave him the smallest of nods. After the meeting broke up, Miss Marple contrived to walk out alongside Caroline. "So pleasant to see everyone in such good spirits," she said conversationally. "One forgets for a moment how very solemn things have been lately." Caroline's smile was thin. "One can't mourn forever, Jane. And really, Mr. Briggs was not a close friend to any of us." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "though he was important enough to have his place at Mrs. Grant's tea table, and to carry something in his pocket that someone valued very much indeed. That was a risk." And Caroline's reaction did not disappoint. The faintest tightening around the mouth, the slight quickening of her pace. "I've no idea what you mean," she said briskly, and turned the conversation to the fete. Miss Marple let it pass. There was no need to press. Later that afternoon, Constable Reed came to her cottage. "All right," he said without preamble. "What did you see?" Miss Marple smiled. "Not what I saw, Tom. What I noticed. People are creatures of habit, especially in small rituals like pouring tea. If a person moves a saucer farther left than the hostess places it, they will likely do the same every time, without thinking. That is why Mr. Briggs's saucer was out of place. It had been set for a left-handed reach. And it is very likely the person who moved it was the same person who slipped something into his cup." Reed frowned. "But that could be." "Several people, yes," Miss Marple said. "But combine it with opportunity to remove the paper from his pocket, and the list is shorter, very short indeed." Reed sat back. "You think you know who it is?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, that I know the type. But the type must be proved to be the person. For that, I will need you to arrange something for me. The plan was simple enough. Reed would invite the key parties, Mrs. Grant, Caroline Dyer, Captain Penrose, and Julia Blake, to the station the following morning under the pretext of clarifying their statements. They would wait together in the small interview room, where tea would be served, ostensibly as a courtesy. Miss Marple would be present, knitting in a corner, while Reed stepped out for a few minutes. The tea would be perfectly safe. She would see to that herself. But the arrangement of the table would be such that if someone were inclined to shift a saucer or lemon slice to their habitual position, they would reveal themselves. The following morning went exactly to plan. The four of them were gathered in the interview room, the tea tray set on the table with cups and saucers placed just so, the lemon plate slightly out of the way, and the sugar tongs aligned neatly. Reed excused himself, leaving Miss Marple to pour. She made a small show of hesitating over who should be served first. Caroline reached forward and, without a word, shifted the lemon plate to the left and drew one saucer closer to her. Far closer than would be convenient for a right-handed pour. It was the same subtle movement Miss Marple had observed in the blue parlor, the same that had placed Mr. Briggs's saucer away from its intended spot. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Reed, who had returned silently to the doorway. He had seen it too. Caroline, noticing his presence, froze for a fraction of a second before covering her movement with a bright remark about the quality of the tea. But the damage was done. Reed's expression had changed, and she saw it. When the tea was finished and the others gone, Reed remained in the room with Miss Marple. "You're sure?" he asked. "As sure as I can be without the paper in my hands," Miss Marple said. She had the opportunity to alter the cup's position, the presence of mind to add something unseen, and the ability to remove the document while the attention of others was on Mr. Briggs. The fact that she seated herself where she could observe everyone else was not coincidence, it was strategy. Reed nodded slowly. "I'll have to be careful. She's clever, and if she still has that paper, she will," Miss Marple said softly. "A person like that doesn't destroy their leverage. It will be somewhere she feels entirely safe." As Reed left, Miss Marple sat back in her chair, the faintest trace of satisfaction in her eyes. The net was drawing in, but she also knew that clever people rarely went quietly. There would be one more move to make, and she intended to be ready when it came. That evening, St. Aldith's seemed unusually still, as though the village itself sensed that something was shifting beneath the calm surface. The lamps in the cottages glowed warmly, but the air outside was sharp, carrying the faint scent of turned earth from the fields beyond. Miss Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting in her lap, not working but listening. Listening in the way one does when the mind is tracing the outline of an answer it has not yet fully put into words. She was certain now of Caroline Dyer's hand in Mr. Briggs's death. But certainty and proof were not the same thing. Caroline was shrewd enough to survive on suspicion alone, as long as nothing tangible could be laid before the magistrate. And the missing document, the draft will, was the tangible thing. Without it, everything else was circumstantial. Miss Marple knew Caroline's type. She would not destroy the paper. It was too valuable, both as leverage over Mr. Calthorpe and as a shield should she be accused outright. The question was where she had hidden it. Somewhere safe, somewhere she could reach without attracting attention. The answer came to her with the quiet inevitability of a jigsaw piece falling into place. Caroline's front parlor, the tall walnut writing desk with the locked lower drawer, which she had fussed over at the last harvest fete when Miss Marple had admired the grain. Caroline had said it was for personal papers and had changed the subject at once. The next morning, Miss Marple made her way along the lane to the post office. There she found Mrs. Harbottle in a state of bright animation, speaking in a low voice to a customer. As soon as Miss Marple entered, the conversation stopped and was replaced with a polite greeting. That was all the confirmation she needed. Word of Caroline's visit to the post office yesterday had already begun to make the rounds. She had come, Mrs. Harbottle explained, to send a small parcel to a cousin in Bath. But the cousin's name had escaped her entirely. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple had relayed this to Constable Reed. "If she has sent the document away," Miss Marple said, "we may be too late. But I do not think she has. A woman like Caroline prefers to keep the thing close so that she may take it out and gloat over it, and be certain it is still in her possession." Reed frowned. "If you're right about the desk, I can't search it without a warrant. And to get one, I'd need more than we've got." "Then," Miss Marple replied, "we must arrange for her to open it herself, and willingly." The opportunity came sooner than either expected. That evening, Caroline invited a small group, Mrs. Grant, Captain Penrose, and Julia Blake, to tea at her house, a gesture she claimed was meant to mend the atmosphere in the village. Miss Marple, through the subtle art of being precisely where she was needed, secured an invitation as well. The tea was held in Caroline's front parlor. The walnut desk stood against the far wall, its polish gleaming in the lamplight. Conversation flowed politely over the tea service, though the undercurrent of tension was unmistakable. Julia kept her eyes lowered. Captain Penrose seemed restless, and Mrs. Grant sat upright as if she were attending a committee meeting. Miss Marple waited until the moment was right. She let Caroline speak at length about her late husband's fondness for collecting autographs, and then, as though it were an idle thought, she said, "You know, my dear, I once saw the most curious thing. A gentleman who hid a quite valuable paper inside a bundle of old letters, thinking no one would think to look there." It was nothing more than a casual remark, yet she saw the faint tightening around Caroline's eyes, the slight shift of her shoulders toward the desk before she caught herself. Mrs. Grant, oblivious to the undercurrent, leaned forward. "What an odd idea. Why would anyone hide something valuable in a desk, of all places?" "To keep it safe, naturally," Miss Marple said, her tone as innocent as a child's. "Though, of course, that is only safe so long as one's desk is locked, and one has the key." Caroline gave a bright little laugh. "Well, my desk is locked, and the key is right here." She patted the chatelaine at her waist with deliberate emphasis. "Such a pretty key," Miss Marple said admiringly. "I don't suppose you'd show us the inside. I have always thought desks of that style had the most ingenious little compartments." Caroline hesitated, but to refuse outright would have been to draw attention. "Oh, there's nothing interesting inside," she said, rising nonetheless and crossing to the desk. She unlocked the drawer and slid it open with a briskness meant to convey nonchalance. Inside were neatly stacked bundles of letters tied with ribbon, a few account books, and a slim folder of cream paper. Miss Marple's eyes did not linger on the folder, but she noted its placement and the way Caroline's hand hovered over it before selecting one of the letter bundles. "See? Bills and old correspondence. Hardly. Fascinating." She closed the drawer quickly and locked it again, returning the key to her chatelaine. It was enough. Miss Marple caught Read at the corner of the lane as she walked home. "It is there," she told him simply. "Lower right drawer, under the second bundle of letters from the top. You will need to be quick." The constable looked troubled. "If I confront her, she'll deny it and say I've no right to look." Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Then you must give her a reason to offer it up herself. Something that will make her believe she must produce it to save herself." The next morning, Read did exactly that. Summoning Caroline to the station, he told her, quite truthfully, that new evidence suggested the missing paper was still in the village. He then lied, very slightly, by adding that it had been seen in another person's possession. "If it's yours," he said, "now would be the time to prove it, before it's claimed by someone else." Caroline, calculating quickly, decided the safest course was to retrieve it herself. "I'll fetch it at once," she said, with the air of one doing the constable a great favor. She returned within the hour, the folder in hand. "Here it is," she said. "As you can see, it's perfectly harmless. Just a draft of a will that Mr. Briggs was working on. I meant to return it to the family, but with all the fuss—" Read took it without comment and passed it to Dr. Atherton, who had been asked to witness the exchange. Inside, folded neatly, was indeed the draft will, and the alterations, written in Mr. Briggs's own hand, which favored a different beneficiary entirely from the one Caroline and Mr. Calthorpe had expected. "It rather changes the picture, doesn't it?" Miss Marple remarked when Read came to tell her. She could not allow Briggs to deliver that version to Calthorpe, and so she ensured he would not. Read's expression was grim. "We've enough now, the opportunity, the means, the motive, and the document itself. It'll go to the magistrate." Miss Marple nodded. "I expect she will be very calm about it. People like that usually are, until the very last moment." She was right. When Caroline Dyer was arrested the next day, she merely lifted her chin and said, "If you think you can prove it, Constable, you are welcome to try." But there was a flicker in her eyes, the same flicker Miss Marple had seen when she first mentioned left-handed tea drinkers. The village settled back into its rhythms, though the talk would not die down for weeks. In the blue parlor, Mrs. Grant resumed her teas, more determined than ever that nothing out of the ordinary should occur in her house again. And in her quiet cottage, Miss Marple finished the pair of gray mittens she had been knitting since that fatal afternoon, reflecting, not without a trace of satisfaction, that human nature, like knitting, was made up of small, deliberate stitches. And it was in those small stitches that the whole pattern was revealed, for anyone patient enough to see it through. The arrest of Caroline Dyer had sent ripples through St. Aldiths, though the surface calm of the village was, as ever, quickly restored in appearance. Curtains twitched discreetly as she was taken away, and the following morning the post office queue was noticeably longer than usual, filled with customers who had no real business beyond exchanging a few whispered theories. By the third day, the talk had begun to shift to more ordinary concerns: the price of potatoes, the likelihood of rain for the fete. But the undercurrent was still there. In a place like St. Aldiths, scandal never truly vanished. It simply faded into the background hum of village life, ready to be stirred up at the smallest provocation. Miss Marple observed all this with her usual serenity. She had no desire to bask in her role in the matter. Indeed, she was content to let the constable receive the public credit. But she knew the business was not yet quite finished. A case in the hands of the magistrate might seem settled. Yet she had lived long enough to know that when a clever person is cornered, there is often one final act. That act came sooner than she expected. On the fourth afternoon after the arrest, Constable Read appeared at Miss Marple's gate. His expression was one she recognized at once, the look of a man with unwelcome news. "She's denying everything, of course," he said, once she had settled him in her parlor with a cup of tea. "Claims she found the draft will after the tea tucked into a pile of papers at her house. Says she thought it best to hold on to it until things calmed down, to avoid further distress for the family. Her solicitor's backing her up, and unless we can prove she had it at the Willows, she might just wriggle out of this." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "It is not surprising. People rarely admit to wickedness unless they are very tired or very frightened. Caroline Dyer is neither yet." Read leaned forward. "You think she'll slip?" "If given the right nudge," Miss Marple said. "We must show her that her story has a flaw only she can explain, and then watch how she explains it." The opportunity arose at the coroner's inquest, scheduled for the following morning in the village hall. The coroner was a brisk man from the county town, used to cutting through the muddle of rural disputes, and he allowed Caroline to make her statement in full. She stood straight-backed, her voice cool and controlled, repeating the story Read had already heard. She had discovered the will after the death, kept it for safekeeping, and intended to return it in due course. When she finished, there was a murmur in the room. The coroner glanced toward the small group of witnesses seated to one side, his gaze resting briefly on Miss Marple. "Miss Marple, you were present at the tea. Have you anything to add that might clarify matters?" Miss Marple rose slowly, her hands folded lightly before her. "Only an observation, sir. On the afternoon in question, the blue parlor was rather crowded. The tea table was laid out in a particular way. Mrs. Grant is very precise about her arrangements, and yet I noticed that Mr. Briggs's saucer was not where it should have been. It had been moved to the left, as though for a left-handed drinker." The coroner raised an eyebrow. "And the significance of that?" Miss Marple's voice was mild. "Only that Mrs. Dyer, who was seated nearest, is left-handed, and I saw her shift a lemon plate and a saucer in precisely that manner just before the cup was passed to Mr. Briggs. She may not have thought it important at the time, but I also note that she now claims she did not see the will until she was at home. Yet Mr. Briggs was known to carry important papers in his inner jacket pocket, and anyone leaning forward to adjust his saucer might easily have noticed or even removed such a paper without drawing attention." There was a silence in the hall. Caroline's composure faltered for the briefest moment. Her lips pressed together, and she glanced toward her solicitor before replying. "That is absurd. I adjusted nothing except my own cup." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Ah, but your cup was to your right. The lemon plate and Mr. Briggs's saucer were to your left. I am quite sure you recall reaching across him. You were wearing that very pretty gold bracelet, and it caught the light most attractively. I remember thinking it must be very inconvenient for a left-handed lady to serve herself when the table is set for the right-handed majority." The coroner looked at Caroline sharply. "Well, Mrs. Dyer?" Her answer came too quickly. I only moved the lemon, and if I did, it was to make room for the cake plate." Miss Marple did not press further. The point had been made. Read, sitting in the back row, caught her eye and gave a barely perceptible nod. It was not a confession, but it was enough of a crack in Caroline's perfect composure to plant doubt in the minds that mattered. After the inquest was adjourned for the day, Read joined Miss Marple on the green. "You've got her rattled," he said, and the coroner noticed. "She rattled herself," Miss Marple replied. all I did was give her a mirror. The following morning, Reed appeared again, this time with something more solid. We searched her desk again, with the magistrate's approval. Found a small vial in the back of the same drawer as the will. Chemist's label scraped off, but Atherton's certain it's cyanide. That, with your testimony, will hold her. Miss Marple inclined her head. Then it is over. But even as she said it, she knew the village would not see it that way. Caroline's arrest would be dissected over countless cups of tea, her motives embroidered with each telling, until the bare facts were clothed in half-truths and embellishments. Some would insist she had an accomplice. Others would declare she was wrongly accused, the victim of malicious gossip. And in the end, the truth would become just one version of the story, indistinguishable from the rest in the minds of those who had not been there. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the completed mittens folded neatly in her lap. She thought of Mr. Briggs, of the startled expression on his face as he died, and of the small, calculated movements that had led to his end. It was never the grand gestures that revealed the truth, she reflected, but the tiniest ones. The shift of a saucer, the turn of a wrist, the choice to keep a paper rather than return it. Outside, the village carried on. Lamplight in the windows, the sound of voices drifting from the pub, the steady ticking of life resuming its rhythm. Yet beneath it all, human nature remained unchanged, as constant and intricate as any knitting pattern. And Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing its stitches, knew she would always be ready for the next dropped thread. The trial of Caroline Dyer was held in the county town 3 weeks later, and though most of St. Aldith's could not attend, the village followed every step as if the proceedings were being staged on the green. The post office queue became a daily exchange of reliable reports from someone's cousin who had it from a man who knew the usher. And Mrs. Grant, resplendent in her best navy silk, claimed to have been personally urged to appear as a witness. Though, in truth, her invitation had been as general as everyone else's summons. Miss Marple was called early in the trial. She took the stand with the quiet assurance of someone who had nothing to prove, answering each question with precision and an absence of embellishment. She spoke of the tea table arrangement, of the movement of the saucer, of Caroline's habitual left-handed reach, and of the missing will that had later appeared in her desk. She did not speculate about character or motives unless directly asked, and even then she couched her words in gentle observation. "It is often the case," she remarked at one point, "that when people handle an object in a habitual way, they do not realize they are doing something unusual." Caroline sat very still as Miss Marple spoke, her expression composed, though the faint tightening around her eyes betrayed the strain. Her counsel attempted to suggest that someone else could have shifted the saucer and lemon plate, but Miss Marple's calm certainty and her recollection of the gold bracelet catching the light proved difficult to undermine. The most damaging testimony came, however, from Constable Reed, who produced the small vial found in Caroline's desk. Dr. Atherton confirmed its contents and explained that its purity was consistent with the poison found in Mr. Briggs's body. The jury listened intently, and when the prosecution laid out the timeline, Caroline's position at the tea, her opportunity to slip the cyanide into the lemon slice, her possession of the draft will that undermined her ally's claim, the pattern was hard to ignore. In the end, the verdict was guilty. Caroline heard it without a flicker of emotion, only lifting her chin as if to indicate she had expected no better from a world that, in her view, had failed to appreciate her cleverness. She was sentenced to a term of imprisonment, and as she was led away, she glanced once toward Miss Marple, not with hatred, but with something colder. An acknowledgement, perhaps, between two women who understood exactly how the game had been played and won. When the news reached St. Aldith's, the village settled into a curious mixture of relief and unease. There was satisfaction, of course, in knowing the matter was resolved, but there was also a kind of disappointment that the drama was over. The harvest fete was approaching, and people were already beginning to fold the tale of the death in the blue parlor into the village's stock of oft-repeated stories. In years to come, it would be embroidered with fresh details. Someone would remember a quarrel between Caroline and Mr. Briggs that had never happened. Another would insist that Miss Marple had spotted the poison in the cup before it was drunk. Such is the way of memory in a small place. One afternoon, a few days after the trial, Miss Marple was seated in her cottage parlor when Julia Blake called. The girl looked tired but relieved, as though a weight had been lifted from her. "I wanted to thank you," Julia said earnestly. "If it hadn't been for you, they might have gone on thinking it was me." "My dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "I never thought it was you. You were frightened, yes, but not of discovery. Only of being drawn into something you wanted no part of. That is a very different thing." Julia colored slightly. "I suppose I was afraid of my uncle, too. Mr. Calthorpe, he can be persuasive. But I think now he'll leave me alone. He's not likely to want his name in any more courtrooms." Miss Marple nodded. People who enjoy influence dislike the light being turned upon them. They will avoid it if they can. As Julia left, Miss Marple reflected that the girl would be all right. Youth has a way of recovering from brushes with scandal, provided the scandal is not of one's own making. That evening, Miss Marple was visited by Constable Reed. He had come, he said, to bring her the formal thanks of the magistrate, though his expression suggested he also wanted to talk over the case one last time. "You saw it before I did," he admitted. "The way she moved things about the table, I might never have noticed." "It is only a matter of knowing what to look for," Miss Marple said. "People reveal themselves in trifles, how they stir their tea, how they fold a letter, how they place a chair. The trouble is that most observers are looking for grand gestures." Reed smiled. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple," Miss Marple said, "but not easy." When he had gone, she took up her knitting and sat for a while in the glow of the fire. The mittens were long since finished, but she liked the feel of the needles in her hands, the quiet, repetitive motion that allowed the mind to wander. Her thoughts drifted over the whole affair, the startled look on Mr. Briggs's face, the neatness of Mrs. Grant's tea table, the shifting of a saucer, the faint scent of almonds. All of it had been there to be seen, if one only knew the value of the smallest stitch in the pattern. A week later, the harvest fete was held on the green under a mild autumn sky. Stalls were laden with cakes and jams, the brass band played cheerfully, and the laughter of children drifted over the hedges. Mrs. Grant presided over the tea tent with her usual authority, ensuring that every cup and saucer was precisely in place. She greeted Miss Marple warmly, as though nothing untoward had ever occurred in her blue parlor. And Miss Marple, who understood the value of letting certain things rest, returned the greeting in kind. As she sipped her tea, she listened to the pleasant hum of the fete, catching here and there a whispered mention of the trial, a speculative remark about Mr. Calthorpe, a question about whether the blue parlor would ever feel quite the same again. She smiled to herself. Life, like knitting, had its dropped stitches, but the pattern could always be picked up and carried on, though never quite without the mark of what had gone before. And so the day wore on, the fete a success, the village content once more in its gentle routines. Yet Miss Marple, as she walked home in the soft light of evening, knew that beneath the calm there would always be secrets, small and large, waiting for the moment when they might rise to the surface. She had seen too much of human nature to believe otherwise. At her gate, she paused to look back at the green, where the last of the stalls were being dismantled, and the air still carried the faint scent of baking and trampled grass. It was, she thought, a comforting picture. But like all such pictures, it was only the surface. Beneath it, the currents still ran. And when they did, she would be ready. For Miss Marple understood better than most that in a place like St. Aldith's, the greatest mysteries were not those solved in courtrooms, but those that unfolded quietly, in the small shifts and murmurs of everyday life, mysteries of pride and fear and vanity, stitched invisibly into the fabric of the village, waiting for the eye that knew how to read them. And as she closed her garden gate and stepped inside, she was already wondering, with a faint, knowing smile, what the next dropped thread would be. November crept into St. Aldith's, with bare branches scratching at the gray sky and a damp chill that seemed to settle in the bones. The excitement of the harvest fete had faded, replaced by the more muted pleasures of winter preparation. Putting gardens to bed, mending drafty window frames, and ensuring one's woodpile was adequate for the months ahead. Yet, for all the seasonal quiet, there lingered a faint undercurrent of curiosity about the blue parlor business. Miss Marple noticed it in the way people would glance at her in the post office or add a little pause in conversation when she joined a group. It was not unfriendly, but it carried the unspoken suggestion that perhaps she might have one last morsel to share. She had no intention of doing so. The case was finished as far as the law was concerned, and nothing was to be gained by stirring the embers. Still, she was not entirely surprised when a small postscript to the affair presented itself without her seeking it. It began one damp afternoon when Mrs. Harbottle called at Miss Marple's cottage with a parcel of knitting wool that had been misdelivered. She stayed for tea, as she invariably did, and after a little talk about the merits of double ply versus triple ply, she leaned forward confidentially. "You remember Mr. Calthorpe, of course," she began, lowering her voice as though he might be hiding behind the tea cozy. "Well, I hear he's gone abroad. Quite suddenly, too. Left his house in much tethering, shut up, and told no one where he was going, not even the vicar's wife, and she's his cousin." Miss Marple's knitting paused for the briefest moment. "How very sudden," she murmured. "I hope he is in good health?" "Oh, perfectly," Mrs. Harbottle assured her. "But there was some talk, only talk, mind you, that he'd had letters from the solicitors about that will. The genuine will, I mean. The one Mr. Briggs was supposed to draw up before." She waved a hand delicately. "Before the unpleasantness. Perhaps he didn't care for the terms, and thought it best to remove himself from the scene." Miss Marple did not comment, but she found the information interesting. Caroline Dyer's motive had been clear enough, but it had always seemed to her that the ripples of that afternoon spread further than the constable's net had reached. A few days later, she was reminded of it again when Captain Penrose stopped her on the lane. He was looking better than he had during the investigation. The restless air gone, replaced by something more composed. "I'm leaving for the winter," he told her. "Going to stay with friends in Devon. Might even take a trip to the continent." "How pleasant," Miss Marple said. "A change of air can be so beneficial after difficult times." Penrose hesitated, then gave her a wry smile. "You knew, didn't you? All along." Knew what, Captain? That I'd been mixed up with Calthorpe in some of his schemes. I never liked Briggs, but I had nothing to do with what happened to him. Still, when you looked at me in the blue parlor, I thought you might say so in front of everyone. Miss Marple shook her head gently. One must be careful, Captain. It is possible to be guilty of poor judgment without being guilty of murder. He seemed to consider this, then tipped his hat. You're a remarkable woman, Miss Marple. I hope we don't meet again under such circumstances. When he had gone, she stood for a moment in the pale sunlight, reflecting that in most crimes, the principal actors were only part of the story. Around them, like the outer threads of a tapestry, were those whose smaller choices and compromises helped set the stage. They were not villains, perhaps, but they were not entirely innocent either. As December approached, the village settled further into its winter routine. Mrs. Grant resumed her teas with renewed vigor, determined to prove that her blue parlor could once again be the setting for genteel conversation rather than whispered speculation. Miss Marple attended one such gathering out of courtesy, finding the arrangement of cups and saucers quite as precise as before. The lemon plate was in its proper place, the silver gleamed, and Mrs. Grant's manner was one of brisk hospitality. During a lull in the conversation, Mrs. Grant leaned toward Miss Marple. "It's odd," she said in a low voice, "how very little it takes to disturb the peace of a household. I've been thinking about that afternoon, not about the unpleasantness, you understand, but about how easy it was for something to happen in the middle of what should have been an ordinary tea. One forgets how fragile the everyday really is." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "It can be altered in a moment, and often by the smallest of things." She thought of the saucer moved a few inches to the left, the lemon slice lifted and replaced, the folded paper in a pocket. Small acts, each one, but together enough to change the course of several lives. That evening, back in her cottage, she took out the gray mittens she had knitted during the investigation. They were warm and neatly made, without a dropped stitch, and she decided to send them to her nephew's wife for Christmas. As she wrapped them, she reflected that solving a mystery was not so different from knitting. One worked patiently, row by row, noticing the small irregularities until the whole pattern was revealed. In the weeks that followed, snow fell over St. Aldiths, softening the outlines of the cottages and hedgerows. The talk of the blue parlor gradually faded, replaced by speculation about the weather and the usual good-natured quarrels over the church decorations. But for Miss Marple, the case remained quietly present, not as a source of excitement, but as another example, neatly filed in the catalogue of her mind, of how human nature reveals itself in the tiniest of ways. And so life in the village went on. The clock in the church tower chimed the hours, the lanes grew muddy and then froze hard, and the people of St. Aldiths returned to their familiar habits. Yet Miss Marple, who knew better than most how little separated peace from disturbance, kept her eyes gently open. There would, she was certain, be other puzzles to untangle, other patterns to trace in the quiet fabric of village life. For in St. Aldiths, as anywhere, the truth was never far away. It was only waiting for the moment when someone, somewhere, would notice the stitch that was just a little out of place. The new year came to St. Aldiths with a brittle frost that rimed the hedges and made the roofs sparkle under the pale winter sun. Life in the village had resumed its gentle rhythm. The blue parlor affair now consigned to the same comfortable drawer of memory that held past scandals, to be taken out and dusted off on long winter evenings, then put away again with the other extraordinary events that, in truth, were extraordinary only because they interrupted the familiar. Miss Marple, for her part, had no wish to disturb that peace. She had resumed her customary habits, tending the small borders in her garden against the coming spring, visiting acquaintances under the pretext of returning books, and writing to her nephew in London with news of the village that, she suspected, interested him far less than he pretended. Yet she remained aware, as she always did, of the undercurrents, the small changes in behavior, the shifts in tone, the absence or presence of certain people at certain places. It was on one such mild January morning, crisp and still, that she encountered Julia Blake on the lane. Julia was walking briskly, cheeks flushed from the cold, but slowed when she saw Miss Marple. "Good morning," she said, smiling warmly. "I've just been to the post office, a letter from my uncle and much tethering." "Mr. Calthorpe?" Miss Marple asked, noting the careful neutrality in Julia's voice. "Yes. He's abroad now, in Italy apparently. He says he's in excellent health and hopes I am well, but—" Julia hesitated. There was something odd about the letter. He asked a great many questions about the village, who's living where, what's being said about the trial, but nothing personal about me, as though he were taking stock. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Perhaps he wishes to ensure he still has a grasp on matters here. "Perhaps," Julia agreed, though her tone suggested she was unconvinced. She thanked Miss Marple for her help during the affair, and they parted at the churchyard gate. That evening, by the fire, Miss Marple considered the exchange. She had no doubt that Mr. Calthorpe's interest in village gossip was not merely idle curiosity. People like him liked to know the lay of the land, to gauge where influence could be exerted or advantage taken. But his distance, and Caroline Dyer's absence, meant that for now, St. Aldith's was spared further disturbance. The weeks slipped by. A thaw set in, turning the lanes muddy and bringing the first shy snowdrops to the sheltered corners of the gardens. At the vicarage, plans began for a spring bazaar, and the committee meetings provided a welcome diversion for those who enjoyed the small theater of arranging stalls and debating raffle prizes. Miss Marple attended, as she always did, content to listen and occasionally offer a suggestion that steered matters quietly away from discord. It was during one such meeting, held in the vicarage morning room, that Mrs. Grant leaned toward her and murmured, "I suppose you must miss the excitement now that everything is over?" Miss Marple smiled. "I cannot say I do. I find a tranquil tea table far preferable to one with unexpected drama." Mrs. Grant gave a little laugh, then sobered. "Still, it was quite something, wasn't it? To think that such a thing could happen here. I've taken to locking the blue parlor whenever I'm not using it." "A wise precaution," Miss Marple said. She knew from long experience that caution was a habit more easily formed after an incident than before. By early March, the matter had receded still further, and Miss Marple found herself drawn back into the quiet details of village life. She visited Mrs. Harbottle at the post office to collect a package of seed catalogs, lingered at the baker's to exchange news about the price of flour, and called on an elderly neighbor recovering from influenza. The days grew perceptibly longer, and the first daffodils began to show their green shoots. And yet, every so often, something would remind her of that afternoon in the blue parlor. The clink of a spoon against porcelain, the sharp scent of lemon, the sight of someone moving a saucer without thinking. These small cues did not trouble her. They simply affirmed what she had always known. Human nature, like the seasons, might change its outward appearance, but its underlying patterns remained. One blustery day, as she sat by her window with her knitting, she saw Captain Penrose pass by on the lane, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He paused at the gate to tip his hat, and she wondered whether his travels had cured him of his restlessness or merely postponed it. Men of his temperament seldom stayed still for long, but she thought he might have learned something from recent events, even if it was only that appearances in a small village are as carefully observed as any parade ground maneuver. By April, St. Aldith's had fully turned its attention to the bazaar. The vicar's wife fretted over bunting, Mrs. Grant insisted on supervising the tea tent, and Mrs. Harbottle contributed a raffle prize in the form of a tin of biscuits from a very good shop in Torquay. Miss Marple, who was helping to oversee the bookstall, spent a contented afternoon sorting donations into neat piles, quietly setting aside the more salacious novels to be offered discreetly to those who would appreciate them. The bazaar itself passed without incident, though it provided its own small pleasures. Overheard remarks, the quiet satisfaction of a well-chosen purchase, the sight of neighbors content in each other's company. Miss Marple left that evening with a modest basket of books, a jar of local honey, and the pleasant sense that the village, for all its occasional upheavals, had righted itself once more. And yet, as she walked home under the first stars, she knew it was only a matter of time before the next ripple disturbed the surface. It might be months or even years, but it would come. Not because St. Aldith's was especially prone to trouble, but because wherever people lived together, they carried with them the seeds of their own dramas. In her sitting room, she placed her purchases on the side table, lit the fire, and took up her knitting. Outside, the wind rustled the budding branches, a reminder that spring was coming in earnest. She smiled to herself, thinking not of the past case, but of the certainty that another would arrive in due course. And when it did, she would be ready. With her needles in hand, her eyes open, and her mind quietly tracing the pattern beneath the surface of things. For Miss Marple had learned long ago that, in the smallest of villages, the most ordinary of days could, with the lightest shift of a saucer or the quietest passing of a paper, become the beginning of a mystery. And it was in those small beginnings that the truth always lay, waiting for someone patient enough to see it. May came to St. Aldith's in a flush of green hedgerows and blossoming apple trees, the air carrying both the sweetness of spring and the faint hum of bees busy in the cottage gardens. By now, the blue parlour business, as the villagers had settled on calling it, had slipped even further into the background. It was spoken of less in terms of scandal and more as a sort of shared story, something to be recounted with slight alterations to visitors or newcomers over a pot of tea. Miss Marple, whose role in the affair had never been officially recorded in any newspaper, was perfectly content with this arrangement. She knew that the truest account of such matters rarely matched the one that survived in local memory. And she, as always, preferred to let people believe what they liked, so long as the essentials of justice had been served. One soft afternoon, she was sitting in her small garden trimming a row of lavender when Mrs. Harbottle came up the path with the unmistakable look of someone carrying tidings. "A letter for you, Miss Marple," she announced, producing it from her handbag. "It came through my hands at the post office, and I thought it might be important. Foreign stamp, you see." The envelope was postmarked from Florence. Miss Marple thanked her and waited until Mrs. Harbottle had gone before opening it. The letter was short, the handwriting firm and deliberate. "Dear Miss Marple, you will be relieved to know that I am enjoying excellent health and have decided to remain abroad for the foreseeable future. Italy agrees with me. I trust St. Aldith's is as peaceful as ever, though I imagine you are always ready should that change. Yours sincerely, Charles Calthorpe. There was no further comment. No allusion to Caroline Dyer, no mention of the will that had been at the center of the whole business. Yet Miss Marple found herself reading between the lines. There was an edge to the otherwise polite phrases, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that he understood she had seen through more than she had chosen to say aloud. A few days later, Julia Blake came to tea. She had been away visiting friends and returned looking fresher, with a shade more confidence in her manner. "It's strange," she said, pouring herself a cup. "How quickly people find something new to talk about. It's as if they've decided Caroline never existed." "That is one way of moving on," Miss Marple replied. "We humans have a gift for altering our memories to suit our comfort." Julia hesitated, then added, "I've decided to take a position in London. A friend of mine has recommended me to a dressmaker, quite respectable. And I think it will be good to start somewhere new." Miss Marple approved. Fresh surroundings can be very restorative, and London is a fine place to observe human nature if one is inclined to. Julia laughed. "I'll leave that to you. I think I've had enough of mysteries for one lifetime." Yet mysteries have a way of finding their own paths. That summer, small oddities began to surface in the village. Nothing serious, but enough to amuse Miss Marple. A missing brooch returned mysteriously to its owner's windowsill. An unsigned note left in the church porch, warning Mrs. Grant that her cook was skimming the cream from the milk before it reached the jug. A petty quarrel between two neighbors over a garden fence, resolved almost too tidily, as though nudged by an unseen hand. Miss Marple made no inquiries. She simply filed away each incident in her mind, noting how quickly the balance of a place could be disturbed, and how easily it could be restored again by someone with a knack for subtle interference. In July, Captain Penrose reappeared, sun-browned and in unusually good humor. He called at Miss Marple's cottage to return a book she had lent him before his travels. "No mysteries this time," he assured her, setting it on the table. "I'm determined to keep my affairs dull for the foreseeable future." "Dullness," Miss Marple observed, "is a quality one comes to value with age." Penrose grinned. "Perhaps I'm getting old then, but if trouble does come again, I dare say you'll have it solved before I've even found my boots." The rest of the summer passed in a haze of warm days and gentle evenings. Miss Marple attended the church garden party, helped judge the jam competition, always a delicate task requiring diplomacy as much as discernment, and enjoyed the return of swallows to their nests under the eaves. Yet now and then, as she sat with her knitting in the quiet of the evening, her thoughts drifted back to that moment in the blue parlor. The startled look on Mr. Briggs's face, the tiny shift of a saucer, the faint trace of almonds in the air. She had seen many such moments in her life, the small, almost imperceptible actions that altered the course of events entirely, and she knew she would see them again in one form or another. For St. Aldith's might appear tranquil, but it was as full of human nature as any place in the world. And human nature, in her experience, was always ready to provide a fresh puzzle. One evening in late August, she walked down to the green, where the setting sun lit the church windows in gold. From the lane behind her came the sound of two villagers in conversation, their voices low, but carrying just enough for her to catch the words, "If anyone would know, Miss Marple would." She smiled to herself. It was not a reputation she had sought, but it was one she had long since accepted. And as she turned toward home, the swifts wheeling above her, she thought, with no particular urgency but with quiet certainty, that the next dropped thread in the fabric of village life was already being spun, somewhere out of sight. And when it came into view, she would be ready, as always, to pick it up. September slipped in on a hush of cobwebs and ripe hedgerows, the afternoon soft with light that lingered over the green as if reluctant to leave. St. Aldith's, having folded the blue parlour business into its lore, busied itself with blackberrying and talk of preserving sugar. The post office smell turned orchard sweet. In such weather, even scandal seems a story from last winter rather than something that once sat at a tea table and stopped a man's heart. Miss Marple, who had been transplanting a clump of Michaelmas daisies along her low stone wall, straightened carefully and regarded her handiwork. It would do. She had learned long ago that borders are improved by restraint. One color set against another in proper proportion, and that the same was true of conversations. She washed her hands at the outside tap and, basket on arm, set off toward the baker's for a loaf. The day so pleasant, it would have been ungracious not to enjoy it. Near the corner by the vicarage gate, she met Mrs. Grant, who was returning from the church with a small sheaf of papers held like a hymn book. "Recipes," Mrs. Grant announced with the air of one clutching dispatches from the front. "For a parish booklet. I've prevailed on half the women in St. Aldith's, and the other half will come round when they see how tidy I've made it." "How very enterprising," Miss Marple said. "People are always grateful to be told their own recipes in proper print." Mrs. Grant's mouth softened into something like amusement. "Well, if no one minds being edited for their own good, all will be well. You'll contribute your seed cake, of course." "If asked," Miss Marple replied, which Mrs. Grant took for consent. They parted with civilities. Miss Marple went on, thinking of edited recipes, of edited memories, and how both often omitted the very pinch of salt that made things true. At the baker's, two ladies were deep in a difference over whether a Viennese whirl could be considered English enough for the fete stall. Miss Marple waited, patient and, apparently, absent. But her ears were open. It was not cake she was after. It was the sound of the village thinking that interested her. People do not always show you their souls, but they will often show you their habits, and that is nearly the same. On her way home, she paused at the churchyard to read the newer stones, as she always did. Grief is moved on from in public more quickly than it is in private. The headstones keep the truer record. She was about to turn away when she heard a light step behind her and looked round to find Julia Blake, cheeks flushed by the breeze and a London hat doing its cheery best against the honest country day. "Miss Marple," Julia said, pleased and a little breathless. "I've come down for the weekend. My friend's shop closes on Mondays. It feels odd to be a visitor." "London suits you," Miss Marple observed. "You are standing more on your own feet." Julia laughed. "I think I'm standing on other ladies' pins half the time, but yes, it is different." "Oh, Mrs. Harbottle says there's to be a small tea tomorrow at Mrs. Grant's for those contributing to the recipe book. She asked whether I might come and bring a metropolitan notion, whatever that is." "Mrs. Grant likes a program," Miss Marple said mildly. "You will do very well if you bring an opinion on the correct thickness of lemon curd." Julia grinned, then sobered. "Sometimes, when I think of that room, I hear the cup fall. I don't suppose that goes away entirely." "It becomes part of the pattern," Miss Marple said. "Woven in, not unpicked." The next day's tea was a smaller, chastened cousin of the one Sant Aldith's had once expected from the blue parlour. The room was as bright as ever, the geraniums fresh on the sill, and the aubusson showed only the faintest memory of a stain. The tray came in with a proper rustle, Edna more assured now in her role. Mrs. Grant presided with a determined cheerfulness that suggested she meant to restore the authority of the room by sheer force of intention. Julia, Captain Penrose, Mrs. Harbottle, the vicar's wife, and Miss Marple made up the circle. Conversation took its natural course. Recipes, parish notes, a rumor of a new curate. And Miss Marple, quietly content, watched hands move. The vicar's wife modestly rearranged her spoon, as if the silver might observe her. Captain Penrose kept his long fingers firmly away from the lemon dish, as though it might be booby-trapped. Julia, after the smallest hesitation, reached for honey and then changed her mind, and took sugar, as a London girl might, to prove she could. It was when Mrs. Harbottle reached for the milk that something shifted, no more than a thread in a carpet pulls when you pass. But to Miss Marple, it was clear. Mrs. Harbottle drew back suddenly with a small "oh," and placed the jug down with a care out of keeping with a simple scald. Her hand, patient with stamps and parcels, trembled for a second. The vicar's wife asked whether she had splashed herself. Mrs. Harbottle said too quickly that she had not. Edna, passing the cake, looked from the jug to Mrs. Harbottle and then, unmistakably, to Miss Marple. It was not a plea exactly, but it was the look of a girl who has seen something and wonders if it is her place to speak. Miss Marple smiled at her with that particular kindness older women keep for young ones when they want them to be brave without being foolish. When the others were admiring the vicar's wife's contribution, a respectable sponge, Miss Marple said, as if on a tangent, "I recall, at the bazaar last spring, someone remarked that milk keeps better if one leaves a pinch of soda in the jug after washing, though it will curdle a lemon cream if one forgets to rinse it out." Mrs. Grant stiffened. "Whoever said that should be turned away from my kitchen," she pronounced. "One does not put chemist's matter where food belongs." "Oh, I dare say it was only thrifty advice," Miss Marple said, a little apologetically. "But some advice spoils a sauce, like opinions, if added at the wrong moment." A quiet settled, a passing cloud across talk. Mrs. Harbottle set down her cup and folded her hands. "Edna," she said to the maid with gentle dignity, "would you be so good as to fetch a fresh jug from the pantry?" When Edna had gone, Mrs. Harbottle leaned toward Miss Marple. "You've a way of taking the sting out, dear," she murmured. "I was told, wrongly, that soda would keep the jug from souring, and I forgot to rinse it. I noticed when the milk took that odd edge. No harm done." She glanced at Mrs. Grant and added, "And no trouble meant." Mrs. Grant, to her credit, let out a breath and inclined her head. "We shall call it a near miss," she said, in a tone that suggested near misses would be removed by policy henceforth. "And we'll put into the recipe booklet a note about rinsing. One can improve a parish as well as a pudding with the right instruction." Edna returned with the fresh jug, and the talk flowed again, diverted back into safe channels. Miss Marple took a little lemon curd on seed cake and listened, not to ferret out a wrong, for there was none, but to confirm a rightness reasserting itself. The room had accepted its lesson and incorporated it with dignity. It was, she thought, exactly how order should be restored, by the smallest acknowledgments, quietly made. Later, walking home through the mellow afternoon, Miss Marple felt that particular contentment that comes when a pattern is complete. Not the loud satisfaction of a verdict, those belong to courts, but the humbler pleasure of a household mended. She paused at her gate to pinch back a bold sprig of mint and heard, from over the hedge, Captain Penrose's voice bidding Julia goodbye. The young laugh that answered him was lighter than in spring. Things, then, were not broken. They were repaired. Days shortened by degrees that only gardeners and children count. The first misty mornings put pearls on the spider's work. The evening light came earlier, gold on the lich gate and the flint of the church. There were other small matters. The return of Mr. Potts' terrier with a defiant ham bone, and the subsequent diplomacy with the butcher. A misplaced brooch discovered tucked in a hymn book and returned through the vicarage letter slot without signature. A note in a hand Miss Marple recognized as Edna's, on Mrs. Grant's kitchen table. Rinsed twice. Life learned. It always did, if the lesson was taught kindly. One quiet Sunday after service, the vicar fell into step beside Miss Marple as the congregation streamed toward the green. "It seems to me," he said, in the tone of a man who has been considering a sermon and found a better thought for a different day, "that the devil is rarely in great temptations. He lurks in trifles, in a little vanity, a little stinginess, a small desire to be thought clever." "It is the trifles we have time for, Vicar," Miss Marple said. "We practice them more, and so they do most of the harm and most of the good." He smiled, satisfied, and veered off to rescue a notice from being pinned crookedly to the church door. Miss Marple, who admired zeal if it remained tidy, went on to the green. She bought a pot of marmalade from Mrs. Harbottle, whose labels had improved and whose conscience, one felt, had been washed as thoroughly as her jugs. She paused to admire Julia's new hat, which managed to be alarming and charming at once, and nodded to Captain Penrose, who was restraining himself from offering advice about the tug-of-war rope. In her cottage, the late son found the shelf where her letters lay. On top, as if it had floated there of its own accord, rested a foreign postcard, Florence again. A photograph of a cloister, all arches and cool shadow. On the back, in the firm hand she recalled, were the words, "The lemon trees are in fruit. Yours, C.C." No more than that. As if the sender wished to show he could write without consequence. Miss Marple placed it beneath the plant ledger, and after a moment's thought, weighed the ledger with the salt pot. Not because there was anything dangerous in a postcard, but because there is a way of dealing with certain people that involves neither acknowledgement nor pique. Only the habit of not making space for them on one's mantelpiece. In the evening, she sat with her knitting and watched the last light withdraw from the hedge. The pair of gray mittens had long since gone to London. On her needles now was a cardigan for a neighbor's child who, given his habit of climbing trees in church clothes, would need 2 more before winter's end. The wool ran soft through her hands, stitch by patient stitch, the pattern emerging as all patterns do, not at first glance and not by declaration, but through the quiet accumulation of small correctnesses. Once, when she was younger, a gentleman had asked Miss Marple whether she liked mysteries. She had said then that she preferred gardens. At her age, she saw that the two were not opposed. In both, one learned to read the signs, to respect the weather of human moods, to cut back what had grown rank, to leave alone what would right itself, and to accept that sometimes things die, and sometimes things take root where one did not plant them. And she had learned that the grand flourish, like a showy delphinium, is not the point. The point is the border seen from a little distance, entire and harmonious, after the small work is done. As the clock chimed 9, she set down her needles and drew the curtains against the first intimation of autumn chill. Somewhere in the lane, a bicycle bell rang, and a girl's laugh answered it. The village settled into itself. Tomorrow there would be washing to watch for rain, a letter to her nephew to be franked by Mrs. Harbottle, who would check the stamp twice, and a call at the Willows to admire the new slipcovers, which Mrs. Grant would describe as an example to the parish. There would be, too, the ordinary chance for mischief and mercy, equal in every day, distributed according to the temper of those who rose to meet it. Miss Marple put out the lamp, and for a moment the cottage held the soft darkness that belongs to rooms long at peace. Then the coals in the grate sighed, as if settling their own argument. She smiled in the dark, that small, private smile that contains more kindness than triumph, and thought, only as one notes the weather, that somewhere someone would presently move a saucer an inch to the left, or choose honey over sugar out of vanity, or tuck a folded paper where it did not belong. And that would be enough. Not to rouse alarm, but to set the tiniest ripple running, traveling out until it met the edge of someone's patience or prudence, and made, at last, a tidy little wave. The kind a very ordinary woman, sitting very quietly in a corner with her knitting, could read. She went to bed content, not because the world was fixed, no world is, but because it had, for the day, resolved into its proper pattern. And for now, that was as much perfection as anyone had a right to demand. I can do that. We'll bring the story to its true close by circling back to the original crime in the blue parlor, letting Miss Marple calmly lay out her full chain of deductions so that every small clue, character, behavior, and concealed motive falls into place. The tone will remain understated but conclusive, with the quiet satisfaction of order restored. The leaves had begun to turn in earnest when the magistrate asked Miss Marple to attend one final meeting at the county court. Caroline Dyer's sentence was already passed. There was no question of her escaping it now. But the magistrate, perhaps out of curiosity more than necessity, wished to hear the whole thing in her own words. How she had arrived at the truth when others had only shadows. It was a small, spare chamber, with Reed in attendance and the magistrate leaning forward in his chair, pencil poised. "It began," Miss Marple said, "with the cup. Or rather, with the saucer. Mrs. Grant is a hostess of fixed habits. Her tea table is set the same way every time. Mr. Briggs's saucer, on that afternoon, was not where it should have been. It had been moved to the left, as one does for a left-handed drinker. Only one such person sat within reach, Mrs. Dyer. That, in itself, was not proof, of course. But then there was the lemon slice. I saw it lifted from the dish and then replaced, as though someone had taken a moment to add something. When Dr. Atherton spoke of a faint scent of almonds, I knew that cyanide was possible, and lemon would mask the bitterness. The final piece came when Julia Blake told me of the paper Mr. Briggs had in his pocket. The draft will. When his body was removed, that paper was gone. Whoever killed him also took it, and that meant the culprit was someone who could act in those few moments of confusion without attracting suspicion. Mrs. Dyer, seated beside him and fussing over the tea, had both the reach and the composure to do so. And when I later saw her, quite without thought, move a saucer in just that same left-handed manner during our little test at the station, I knew. The gesture was as natural to her as breathing, and on the day in question, it was the gesture that delivered the poison. The magistrate made a small, appreciative sound. And the motive? Miss Marple's eyes were mild. Mr. Briggs had altered the will to favor another beneficiary. That cost Mrs. Dyer her expected advantage, both for herself and for her associate, Mr. Calthorpe. Killing him ensured that the altered draft never reached its destination, though she had not reckoned on the strength of the circumstantial evidence, or that the paper's absence would be more suspicious than its presence. Reed gave a short nod. "And you left it for us to do the formal work." "I have always thought it better to let the police take the bow," Miss Marple said. "It saves one a great deal of unwanted conversation in the grocer's queue." The magistrate chuckled softly, closed his notebook, and declared the matter settled. Outside, the autumn light lay soft over the hedgerows, and the air had that stillness that comes before the first real frost. Miss Marple walked home at her usual pace, content. Justice had been done, quietly, without fuss, and the village had returned to its rhythm. That evening, she sat with her knitting in the cozy lamplight of her parlor. The fire hummed in the grate. Outside, a wind was rustling through the last leaves. Somewhere in the village, someone would be choosing honey over sugar, or shifting a chair for the better light, or tucking away a paper with the thought that it might be useful later. Human nature, she reflected, was as unchanging as the seasons. And when the next ripple came, as it surely would, she would be there. Quiet in her corner, knitting in her lap, eyes open for the stitch that didn't quite match the pattern.